And I would like to introduce Barbara Frey and Ray Mancilla, our speakers for today. Barbara is Assistant Professor at the School of Education at Point Park University, and Ray is a Senior Instructional Designer in the School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences in the Office of Online Learning at the University of Pittsburgh. And at this time, I would like to ask them to take it away.
Oh, thank you, Barbara. Well, good day, everyone. Thank you for being here. We really love seeing all your names and places in the chat box. Ray and I were involved with a survey that was administered to Quality Matters institutions in 2019. Maybe some of you even replied to that survey. It was October, November of 2019. And in this webinar, we want to share with you some of the highlights from that survey. As Barbara already said, my name is Barbara Frey. My life is made up of part-time jobs. I'm an adjunct assistant professor with Point Park University, and I also am a consultant, a senior optimization consultant with CampusWorks, which supports higher education institutions. And then I'm also a instructional designer subcontracting with the University of Pittsburgh, Pitt Online. I spent the first 20 years of my instructional design career with Pitt Online. And Ray?
Hi, everybody. Barbara and I have worked together now for a number of years at the University of Pittsburgh. And as Barbara mentioned, our lives are composed of many different jobs. I normally work in instructional design with the School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences at the University of Pittsburgh, and we are working actively to put programs such as physical therapy and occupational therapy, many clinical foci online. So that's what I do most of the time. We also enjoy engaging in research. So as Barbara mentioned, this will be a project that we embarked upon last year, and we're excited to share out some of the preliminary findings with you. In addition, I do work with Quality Matters to conduct peer reviews, and Barbara and I are both working with IBSTIPI as scholars in their practice. So we stay very busy, and thank you for joining us, some of you from very far away.
The goals for our session are to enhance your awareness of the exemplary practices in accessibility and the policies and practices. We want to look at the tools for creating accessible online materials. We hope you'll be able to recognize advances in accessibility in the past decade, from 2010 to 2020. And we hope you'll be able to leave here identifying some steps that as a QM institution, you can take in improving your online courses. We're going to start with background. So let's start by taking a look at the background for our study. As I said, this was an accessibility survey that was administered to all QM institutions. So I want to give a little background so you know how we got started and why we did it. First, there are two terms you're going to hear today, and those terms are web accessibility and digital accessibility. Web accessibility means that there are no barriers that prevent users, in our case, students and visitors, from accessing or interacting with the web. Our institutions have web accessibility that includes a wide range of websites. It's things like admissions, financial aid, the library, all the athletics, not to mention human resources and all the academic departments and centers that we have at our institutions. And then the second term is digital accessibility, and we're viewing digital accessibility as a subfield of web accessibility. And we mean the ability for students to navigate and understand electronic materials that we put into our online courses. So that's the things like the videos, the podcasts, all the multimedia, all the documents, all the images that go into our course. So the focus of our study and the focus of the survey was digital accessibility in hybrid and online courses. So why do you think accessibility is important? I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir. You wouldn't be here if you didn't think it was important. But according to the National Center for Education Statistics, in fall of 2016, and actually that's the latest statistics that are available at this time, over 6 million students are taking at least one online course. And that's 32%, almost all almost 1/3 of all students in higher education are enrolled in at least one online course. Now, considering that approximately 650 million people worldwide have a disability and 61 million people in the United States have a disability, we know that we have students with disabilities in our courses. And it's likely the number is even higher than what we think because they don't have to disclose in an online course. The latest statistics show that 19% of students undergraduate students are reporting a disability. And then there's some research that's a little bit old from 2013, but it shows that the dropout rate is higher and the graduation rate is lower for students with disabilities when you compare it with students who do not have disabilities. So we have this wonderful opportunity to really make the difference in the lives of many, many students. Historically, two major pieces of legislation protect students with disabilities who take our courses. The first one is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And there's two sections there that are important to us, 504 and 508. And then there's also the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was 1990. Section 504 prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs that receive financial aid, while 508 addresses barriers associated with electronic and information technology. And the Americans with Disabilities Act is a form of civil rights legislation that protects qualified individuals with disabilities from discrimination on the basis of their disability in services, programs, and activities. And then in 2008, the ADA was broadened and the definition of disability was expanded, so it increases an even greater number of students and types of disabilities, and they're all protected in our school settings as well as in the workplace and other settings. So in response to our legal and ethical responsibilities, many institutions have created policies and procedures that foster inclusive digital environments. And leading the way is Quality Matters. So Quality Matters is one of several great institutions or organizations that provide professional development opportunities that equip faculty, staff, and administrators with necessary knowledge and skills. From the very, very beginning, and if you've been around Quality Matters for a while, since 2003, you know that one of the key standards in the rubric has been Standard 8, which emphasizes the course design commitment to accessibility and usability for all learners. Now, in addition to that Standard 8, there's one criterion in Standard 7 that also addresses accessibility policies and services. In total, 4 of the 22 essential standards that are required to be a QM certified course, 4 out of 22 relate to accessibility. So QM's accessibility commitment also extends to their professional development opportunities, and maybe some of you have taken the workshop on addressing accessibility and usability. QM sponsored one of the first benchmarking studies on accessibility in higher education, in online higher education, in 2010. And a colleague and I, Denise King and I, surveyed all participating institutions, and we wanted to determine their policies and practices for making online courses accessible. And there were 2 key findings that came out of this study. One was that most institutions lacked a comprehensive accessibility policy. And the second one was that most respondents really expressed a strong need for further training on accessibility. So as a first step in designing Quality Matters' most recent accessibility survey, Ray and I began by reviewing a massive amount of information, and we divided it into 4 categories. And the first category we looked at was policies and administration issues dealing with accessibility. There is not a ton of literature on this topic, and here's just 3 things that we found that we thought were most relevant. The first one was the study that I was involved in that I just mentioned. And we found in the study only 13% of institutions had a disability policy for their online courses. And we found a surprising 75% of institutions did not have a budget for creating accessible materials. Far more recently, in 2019, there was a survey that was administered by the WebCET and OLC, which is the Online Learning Consortium, and it went to their membership, and their results showed a significant increase, with 60% of their member institutions actually having a digital accessibility policy. So that's much better than we found 10 years ago. And it won't surprise you that the larger the institution, the more likely they were to have a policy. And then a third piece of literature that we found very relevant for what we were doing in our survey was by a thesis by Philip Deaton, and he was with Michigan State. And he found that there was a strong correlation between having a digital accessibility policy and having a digital accessibility coordinator at your institution. And he also noted the many challenges of trying to create a budget forecasting digital accessibility cost. And it was extremely varied because it depended on the type of course, and it depended on the type of disability. So a course such as a geography course with maps or a math course with formulas would be more challenging to develop in an accessible format than something like maybe a psychology course or a history course that was primarily text-based, or maybe had videos that could be easily closed captioned. So another area of literature that we looked at, the second area, and we just made up these categories, what seemed logical to us. And the second category was a broad category that we call group development or course development. We saw the same familiar course practices highlighted in all three of these studies. Massengill and Vasquez, Kurt, and Del and Blackwell. All three of them identified very similar practices to what we see in standard 8.2 and 8.3. And just some examples that you have probably heard of are things like alt text for images, headings for organizing documents, using clear accessible fonts, having high contrast colors, using headers in rows and columns for tables, and using descriptive links, hyperlinks, all very common practices that we find in course development. And then there's the third category of literature that we looked at, and that was on technology tools or assistive technologies that are used to enhance accessibility. And we found that understanding the tool allows you as a course designer or course developer to design a course with materials that maximize the effectiveness and usefulness of those technology tools. And Terrell Thomas and his colleagues highlighted assistive technologies that I bet you've heard of, screen readers, screen magnifiers, text-to-speech software, and then speech-to-text software, and Braille machines were just some of the examples. And Lauren Cifuenza and her colleagues note some very effective free web-based tools from WebAIM. And she used things like the color contrast checker and the Wave web page accessibility checker from WebAIM in her literature. And then the fourth category and the last category that we found for our literature review dealt with training. And we found that educators everywhere and faculty developers are really struggling to determine how to ensure that all courses are accessible, and that faculty and course developers are prepared to develop these online courses. The two categories of centers that were most likely to provide training to faculty or instructional designers or staff were the Centers for Teaching and Learning and the Offices of Disability Services. Most training came out of those two centers. And the most common service was individualized consultations, which was followed by workshops and then followed by group consultations. And again, that same study, the WCET and the OLC survey reported that 2/3 of their member schools provided some kind of accessibility training. And again, it wasn't surprising, the larger the institution, the more likely they were to offer training. So putting this all together, what do you think is the significance? Why did we do this study? Why do we think it was important? Well, there's several reasons. For one, we wanted to replicate that 2010 survey, and we wanted to re-examine the accessibility landscape a decade later. A decade with dealing with technology is a long time. We also wanted to support QM's leadership in the field of accessibility of online courses, and we wanted to contribute to the literature. And the results will also support and inform the QM standards. We view part of our study as being a needs assessment, and we wanted to highlight the professional development needs for faculty and staff, and we wanted to identify the best practices in course development. So that's a little bit about the background. Let me hand this to Ray now, and she can talk about the methodology.
All right, great. Thank you, everybody, for following along. So we had, as Barbara mentioned, these 5 foci, and we really worked to replicate the initial survey that was delivered 10 years ago so we could measure change across time. And we did expand a bit on some of the foci. So we wanted to look specifically at what factors determine institutional policies. Do QM institutions have policies in place to ensure digital accessibility? We focused on the administrative processes and the people that are involved in guiding accessibility across campus for online courses. We wanted to explore from an instructional design lens the course development practices that are being put in place to ensure that course materials are made accessible. And similarly, the tools that are used to create the materials and to assess the materials for digital accessibility compliance. And then finally, as Barbara mentioned, we were looking at this from the perspective of a needs assessment of professional development, as the initial survey 10 years ago really rendered a need for more training in this area. We wanted to explore, is that still the case? And if so, which formats or which types of training are most appropriate? So that was the final piece. In terms of our procedure, we identified participants through the QM database of QM coordinators with the assistance of Quality Matters and Barbara Birch's group. And this method was analogous to the method that was used in Barbara and Denise's legacy study. So we tried to keep the methodology as similar as possible. And we did ask the participants to complete a brief electronic survey that had 30 different items. Some were quantitative, scale-based, and others were qualitative, where we asked for more text open feedback. And they focused on these different sections of policies, processes, practices, technology tools, and PD. We also got some demographics from the institutions. So you can see some sample questions here that really explore what types of questions the participants were asked to answer. For example, how frequently is your video closed captioned? Or what was used to close caption video? So that just gives you a little sample of what we were asking our participants to respond to. And this is a breakdown here of who was involved in the study. We were overall very pleased with our survey response rate. As you know, educational research and survey studies do not always yield 100% participation. We were happy we had 16% of response rate. So of the over 1,700 institutions that were surveyed, we got 273 back, and we cleaned the data so that any incomplete surveys that were completed at less than an 85% rate were removed from the sample. And you can see that of the wide range of roles, we had mostly administrators, and they were 40% of our group. We also had a number of instructional designers who were acting in the role of QM coordinator. So 36% were instructional designers. We also had Faculty developers participate, disability services specialists participate. As you can see, there were very few digital accessibility specialists, which is, sort of a new and emerging role in this arena. So this was a role that did not exist in the 2010 study. So we were pleased to see that at least we have some representation there. We also have instructional technologists among the group. And in terms of the institutional breakdown and who participated, we categorized the participants in a number of different ways. Congruent to the Chloe report, some of the categories on who controls the institution. We were also looking at the size of the institution, the total enrollment, the online enrollment, and the number of online offerings that the institution offered. So you can see in this bar chart, 2-year and 4-year institutions were fairly well represented, 37% and 56% of our sample. And we had a number of public institutions that were 45% of the group. We did see some private nonprofit institutions, but we had very few trade or technical institutions or private for-profit respondents. You can also see from the pie chart that there was a wide range in size from small colleges to large universities, but most institutional enrollments were under 20,000 students, which is consistent with the group that QM serves. So we weren't surprised by this. We also see that most institutions had fewer than 5,000 students, and very large institutions were very uncommon. We also took a look at the number of online students, and we found that about half of the responding institutions had less than 3,000 students online, and 10% indicated that they had more than 11,000 students online. Most institutions offered less than 400 online courses, so that was about 62% of the sample had less than 400 online courses, and a very small proportion, so 9%, had over 800 online courses, which would be, a significant online presence. Okay, moving on to data analysis. Just like to explain a little bit about what we did, what our method was. So as we mentioned, the survey had quantitative and qualitative items. So we used SPSS to perform the descriptive statistic analysis. We did compute chi-square test when we were looking at relationships, cross tabulations between the different demographical variables and the participant responses. So we did find in some cases that there were strong associations between a specific demographic and an answer to one of our questions. So we'll talk more about those in the results. Also, the qualitative questions were coded using inductive and deductive coding techniques, and we used 2 independent reviewers to code the data anonymously to compare findings and identify themes. So that was our overall process. Now, the moment we've all been waiting for, the results. We're just going to go question by question, looking into our first research question about policies and online courses. So here we have first looking at priority. What is the institutional priority for digital accessibility? And we see that 46% of institutions reported that accessibility was a high priority for their organization. But most of the remaining institutions were split between medium and low levels of priority. We were happy to see that few selected non-existent. Only 4% said that it was not even on the radar. Now, as we move into policies themselves, there are associations that we uncovered between level of priority and the presence of policy. So here you can see the pie chart on policy findings, and these were consistent with the level of priority that an institution placed on digital accessibility. So a chi-square test for association was performed between having a policy and high levels of priority. And we saw a very strong statistically significant association between these two variables. So institutions who made accessibility a high priority were more likely to have a policy in place. 48% of institutions reported having a formal policy that had been approved at the institutional level for digital accessibility, not web accessibility. And then of those institutions, you see 43% said no policy, but 16% of those folks had a policy that was drafted. And that was a promising finding, that it wasn't exactly 43% with no policy. There were 16% that have a policy in progress. And that, in fact, was the case for my institution at the time. We had a policy that was going through the governance system and was in this, the Senate for approval. We also took this a step further, and we looked at, for example, the number of online courses that an institution offers and whether or not that impacts having a policy. And we did find that that was the case, that institutions with more online courses were more likely to have a formal accessibility policy. We also explored not just the number of online courses, but the number of online students that the institution served, because that was one of our demographic variables. And we found similarly that there was a positive association between having a policy and having more online students. So that sort of goes hand in hand. The more students that we're serving, the more need there is to put formal processes and policies in place. So that was what we saw here on policy. We also looked at processes in which administrative processes can undergird digitally accessible courses. And what we found was one of the very first pieces was budget, money for making materials accessible. And this is a very important process from the administrative perspective on helping to support the creation and the revision and the evaluation of accessible materials. So we see here that over half of QM institutions do not have a budget for creating course materials, 58%. That was a little lower than what Barbara found 10 years ago. So previously it was a 75% rate. Here it's 58%. We also did a test, another chi-square test for association, and we found that institutions that have a larger number of online courses were more likely to have a budget. So that was also one of the variables, one of the factors in determining budget. So this is one of the pieces that we'll discuss in our implications section. Another process that we looked at is whether or not courses were being reviewed for compliance or to ensure that the materials were accessible for students with disabilities. And if so, who was involved in conducting this type of a review? So as you can see from the bar chart, we found that the institutional responsibility for reviewing courses was fairly evenly distributed among instructional designers and faculty members. So they were the two parties most involved in making materials accessible. We also found through some of the qualitative comments that Quality Matters peer reviewers were playing an important role in compliance with accessibility guidelines. Some respondents also indicated that faculty developers and disability services assisted. And we did find isolated responses of the role of online program management firms, or OPMs, in guaranteeing the accessibility of materials. And that is an emerging trend in online learning. So it's something that we can keep an eye on as we move forward, looking at accessibility research. So as you can see here, most instructional designers and faculty are forerunners in reviewing courses for accessibility compliance. We also wanted to go a little further and look at how often are courses being reviewed. What does the review cycle look like to identify potential barriers for accessibility? And what we discovered was that there were two different review cycles that were most prominent. And it varied between every 1 to 3 years, and then other people reported having no review cycle. So, 44.5% or 45% of people said between 1 and 3 years they're reviewing courses to ensure they're accessible. And then the other 45% said they're never reviewing them. So that was quite extreme in terms of the two different types of review. We did also find that 2-year institutions were more likely to review courses than 4-year institutions. So that was an interesting finding. And we did discover that very few institutions, about 25%, were looking to ensure that their courses were accessible from a mobile device, which is somewhat concerning, as we know that many of our students are accessing courses through mobile devices, and probably more likely now during this COVID-19 scenario. So this is something to think about as we move forward in reviewing materials for accessibility, is whether or not they are compliant with the mobile accessibility guidelines. And we need to do a little more thinking about why 2-year institutions may review more frequently than 4-year institutions. So that was a critical point. Now, moving forward, I'm sure this piece will be really interesting to the instructional design crowd. This was very near and dear to our hearts. Looking at what course development practices are being used to ensure accessibility of our online programs and courses. And this first piece is looking at transcripts, which we would use to accompany any piece of media, right? Audio, podcast, etc., in a course. And we see that the majority of participants indicated sometimes. So their online materials are sometimes accompanied by a transcript. Combining, those who are using transcripts always, often, or sometimes, we do see that transcripts are pretty frequent. So it's about 80% when we put that all together. Few institutions rarely use transcripts. This could be a shift from into a closed captioning, which we'll see in the upcoming slide, that people are maybe preferring to use closed captioning to transcripting. But it is something to take into consideration that we have very few institutions that are always using a transcript. As we move forward on captioning, a related topic to transcripts, institutions are more likely to use captioning than transcripts. We see 47% of institutions are using transcripts often. Instead of 10%, we see 14% are using them always. We did take a further look into why this might be. Does, closed captioning costs money? So is this a financial piece? Does this have to do with the budget? We did not find any relationship between having a budget, an institution having a dedicated budget for accessibility, and closed captioning. This could, like I said, indicate that there are maybe advances in captioning technology here with artificial intelligence, text-to-speech. So we might be seeing more captioning here than transcripting. It could also be that shift into more video-based content than audio-based content. We have a number of speculations of why this might be the case, but we also went into depth looking at who is doing the captioning. I'm sure the instructional designers are saying, please, not me. It's a lot of work. In the absence of a budget, who is doing the captioning? And our question on this topic found that faculty are more likely to create their captions using a software, some sort of software, whereas instructional designers are more likely to use some sort of third-party tool. We think that this might be that instructional designers are more likely to work in a unit that has an online, it's an online unit that may have a Center for Teaching and Learning or some sort of funds allocated, whereas faculty are finding some maybe free tools available. But we did find that most captioning was happening through third-party tools or some sort of dedicated software. Very few people were sending it out to be captioning, to be captioned by another party. So that was interesting. We had other options available. We had options about using student workers or by a multimedia team, or whether the material was publisher-based and already captioned, and those were not very prominent in our sample. And moving forward, we also wanted to look at the usage of various course design practices. And these are the practices that we pulled from the literature. We see here that alt tags was one of the most common accessibility practices incorporated into the instructional design process using alternative text, followed by color contrasts. And we see tools like the Wave color contrast checker that can help with these. Captioning and transcripts, which we just discussed. And as we see, as we go down, much fewer respondents claimed that they were using plain language or keyboard accessibility. So we see, a drop from, an 80% range into a 30% on keyboard accessibility. We also don't see document design as being as popular. When we talk about document design, we're talking about structured headings and tables and other means of making a document accessible. So as you can see, these are all of the different practices that a designer can apply to make material accessible. And relatedly, we asked participants to rate the level of difficulty that they felt it took or effort required to make material accessible by applying these practices. And we categorized these into low, medium, and high efforts. And we were thinking this was pretty interesting because it lends itself into the topic of training. So we can see that most people find that adding a descriptive hyperlink or applying a heading style or making navigation menus consistent, that these are all low effort required and yet a high yield on making the document accessible for a learner with disability. So we thought that was, it was promising to see that people said these were low effort, so we assume that they can be put into practice more frequently. On the flip side, using alternative formats to present material based on UDL guidelines and using captioning or transcripts was something that required high effort on behalf of the course designer. And then everything else sort of fit into the middle. So we do see opportunity here for support and for training in these areas. We wanted to explore a little further what are institutions at QM saying about what challenges they're experiencing when they're working to make courses accessible in digital formats. And the most common piece was a lack of faculty and institutional support for making materials accessible, which sort of cascades into things like the time that people are allocated to do this, the funding and resources, which we saw with a budget. The lack of a formal policy. So we saw that over 40% of our institutions don't have a policy in place to support this kind of an effort. Lack of training, skills in making material accessible, which folds into training, and then a lack of bandwidth, which is also related to time. But we were happy to see that budget, policy, training, these are all pieces that we think can be addressed. And that's the promising piece of this of these findings. And Barbara will talk more about the training needs that were revealed. I'm going to hand this back to Barbara. She's going to talk about technology tools and training.
Okay, as Ray said, our next question was what technology tools are used to create accessible online courses. So when it comes to technology tools, we had two foci that we wanted to consider. We were looking at tools for creating an online accessible course, and there was a separate question about what tools were used for reviewing the online courses for accessibility. And we were really kind of surprised that there was a lot of overlap between the tools. For creating accessible materials, it was Microsoft Office and Adobe, which both have accessibility checkers. And then many people commented on using their LMS, and they used Ally within their LMS. Ally is a digital accessibility checker, and it provides a score for accessibility, and then it also will generate alternative formats for you for the materials in your course. And then YouTube, which has the auto-generated captioning, closed captioning. For reviewing course materials, it was Microsoft Office, number 1, Adobe products, number 2, again, the LMS and Ally was number 3, and WebAIM was number 4. And WebAIM has great tools that we've just mentioned, such as the color contrast checker and the web page accessibility checker, WAVE. So for technology, we really didn't find a lot of new or exciting tools or information that we think that we can use or pass on, because this is probably pretty similar to what most people are using. Our last research question was about professional development. What professional development needs are there for creating online courses? And we knew that training was a hot topic because we've had a lot of people who've addressed that topic with us. So most institutions offer training regardless of the type of institution they are. Across the board, every type of institution was offering training. It didn't matter how big the institution was or what their enrollment was. So out of the 209 respondents we had, 46% said yes, they offered training. 21% said no, they didn't. And then 3% of the respondents were unsure whether they offered training. The target audience for this training was faculty, faculty developers, instructional designers, instructional technologists, and administrators. And then we looked at the formats. What were the most common training formats? Number 1 was internal courses or workshops, which was 66%. So 2/3 of respondents said they used those. Online resources was also a fairly popular source of accessibility training, with about 56% of respondents saying yes, they used online resources. External courses was almost 30%. So a lot of people are taking online courses, and then 31%, or actually almost 32%, said they were using synchronous webinars and getting training through an online webinar. We asked people then to rank their professional development needs. And what we found was that there was a tie for number 1. The number 1 need was plain language and table design. Number 2 was alt text. Number 3 was navigation menus. 4 was headings. 5 was alternative formats for providing information. There was a 3-way tie for number 6. It was readable PDFs, descriptive hyperlinks, and captioning and transcripts, which all were the 6th priority. Number 7 was document design. Number 8 was fonts and color contrasts. And number 9 was keyboard accessibility. And there were also requests there for the QM Standard 8 training. So, Frey, what does all this mean?
I'm pulling it all together before we move into questions. And I can just tell you that this time has flown by. I can't believe how late it is already. What does this mean for moving forward in the camp of digital accessibility? Well, one thing that we noticed, that there is a need to raise the institutional awareness about accessibility for online students, given the lack of policy, the overall lack of administrative processes, budgeting, and so forth. We need to be advocates on campus to bring this to the attention of administrators. We saw that lots of the responsibility for rolling out accessibility mandates rested on the faculty and on the designers. So we need to create an infrastructure with the roles and the responsibilities that can be distributed. And this happens through the creation of a strong policy that will lay out specifications for the consequences for noncompliance, who is responsible for what, and when. Review cycles, establishing regular review cycles. As we saw, there are institutions that are never reviewing. Half of the institutions are never reviewing their online courses to ensure that they're accessible. So we want to be proactive about that. The development of policy and the review of existing policies is another piece, because we found, and the research indicates, that although institutions have policies, there may be gaps in those policies. And those gaps in the policies make them hard to enforce, and they make it difficult for individuals working in those institutions to understand their roles. The creation of a digital accessibility coordinator position is one piece that we've seen come up in the literature as a possibility, a way of moving and advancing these initiatives forward. Also, we found the need to allocate resources, both financial and human. So I saw a comment in the chat about what about individuals who are reviewing courses, manual testers. We need to have resources allocated for salaries for individuals who are going to be performing this work. We did see some people indicated that student workers, create their captions, for example, or review their courses, but we really want trained professionals to be evaluating the courses to ensure that they're a quality learning experience for all of the students and inclusive for all. We've seen the role of Quality Matters peer reviewers come up in our data quite a bit, and so that is another piece, is allowing an institution to review courses on a regular cycle. And then, as Barbara talked about, training is another key piece here, training on best practices. So if we're asking faculty, for instance, to create captions for their courses, we want those captions to be 100% accurate. How can you do that if you don't have the tool or you don't have the skill to do that? So we want to make sure that we're meeting the training needs on campus and in formats that are accessible to faculty and staff. And then we also noticed the need for ongoing support post-training. So, you go to a one-off training, you learn how to use a specific tool or how to apply a specific course development practice. What happens when that faculty member goes back to the office and has to do that in isolation? Is there a way for a faculty member to receive ongoing support? So these were also themes that came up in some of the qualitative data. And then finally, Barbara and I added the need to involve students with disabilities in this conversation to gain their perspective and include them in the conversation about how to make their materials accessible. So we have worked with several student workers in the past who have vetted materials for us, who have vetted tools for us, who have helped raise awareness within our office of areas where there were barriers to accessibility that we did not that we were unaware of. So thinking about ways of integrating students who are key to this conversation into the dialogue is another way that we thought would be appropriate moving forward. And we wanted to open it up to questions and to discussion. I know Barbara Birch has a few slides to cover at the end, but we wanted to take some time here to think about in the chat box. Given what we know, what do you see as next steps at your institution? And then I know we have a number of questions. I see 14 questions in the Q&A, so we are happy to respond as time allows.
Would you like me to start in reading with the questions?
Sure.
See how many we can get to? Okay. All right, and I'll just say that I'm going to try to capture all of these questions so that they can be answered in writing if we don't get to them today. So feel rest assured that your questions will be answered. The first question we have is from Thomas Tobin. Based on your survey results, what balance of accessibility compliance elements versus proactive design practices would you recommend be built into the QM standards, descriptions, or examples? That's a big question.
I didn't answer that because I wasn't sure I understood it.
Okay, well,
I mean, I guess I would say 100%. Thomas, if you can explain that a little bit, that would help me.
Okay, unfortunately, he does not have a mic, but we'll hang on to the question. And if he would like to type some more into the Q&A, we'll look at.
And I think Barbara, this really goes back to the idea, he says that the standards focus on compliance right now. So how far beyond compliance should QM standards go? So that's very interesting, because what you're asking then is how much are we accommodating versus how much are we designing with accessibility in mind? Is that?
Yeah, he says correct.
Oh, okay.
And I mean, I can't answer for QM, but I can say that we shoot for design, proactive design, according to the UDL principles, according to the compliance elements. I think what we want to do is to design so that all of our courses are accessible to everyone. And as we found in many cases, the elements that we're adding for accessibility don't just help a student with a disability. For instance, adding a transcript or closed captioning can be useful for a learner whose native language is not English. It can be useful for a busy parent who has a screaming child and they're taking their online course. So we know that the components that we are designing into courses benefit more than students with disabilities. So I would say that we want to shift from the compliance and accommodation mindset into, what does it mean to be inclusive? How can we build inclusivity into the design? And it's always easier to build it in than to retrofit.
Right. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Using closed caption for videos, is there an option to select closed caption for Panopto videos, YouTube videos, and other major programs used to record and show videos?
Yes, Panopto has the option for captioning, and YouTube will automatically generate captions as well.
But I think the YouTube captioning is not at 100% accuracy, so it is concerning. You have to proceed with more caution with YouTube if you're not personally doing the captioning, because in many cases, if there is interference, you don't get 100% accuracy, which is the law, 100% accuracy. With Panopto, you can generate a caption file, you can upload a verbatim transcript. So there are various methods for adding captions to Panopto videos.
You can edit in both Panopto and YouTube. You can edit the captions. And
Yes,
somebody just mentioned Otter. Otter's a new app that I've had good luck with. It has been fairly accurate too, but more for transcripts actually than captioning.
And these tools are advancing so quickly with artificial intelligence and natural language processing that I think it's only going to get better and better. And we did see this increase in closed captioning and the preference to using closed captioning to using transcripts. So I do see a question in the chat from Robert about, if your video is closed captioning, do you also need to have a transcript? And typically you would select the closed captioning to the transcript. The transcript would be necessary for a podcast where you couldn't see the closed captions, depending on the podcast player. We also see some comments here in the chat about using Kaltura for auto captioning, using Canvas Studio, which is a Canvas tool, and someone else using Stream with different degrees of accuracy. So,
okay,
thank you for sharing.
Diana posted a link in the Q&A that I'm unable to copy over to the chat. So if you would like to put that in the chat, Diana, that will be helpful, from University of Tennessee. Lauren asked, what % of institutions are reviewing courses for digital accessibility versus not doing that? So I'm not sure if your study got into that.
Yes, well, we saw 24% are not, 24% are reviewing. So only 24% are reviewing. So that's pretty low. So institutions that have policies are not necessarily evaluating compliance with the policy.
Okay, let's see. My Q&A is moving on me.
I see a comment about the 2011 study. What's been so interesting is, as we were preparing for this webinar, we realized we had so much data and so much information that this is going to be released in a series. So the 2010 comparison, we have not completed all of the analysis for, but there there are some areas where we have, you know, we started looking into the comparison. So budget is one of those examples. But we are still working on the full comparison. So we're just sharing out some of the preliminary pieces, but please stay tuned.
Okay, Dr. Ford asks, I struggle to find a transcribing option that does not require me to toggle between two different programs. Does something exist where I can create my videos and it can be transcribed or captioned as I speak?
I would try that Otter app. That might be useful for you. If anybody else has a suggestion, would you type it into the chat, please?
It looks like a lot of people are typing suggestions in the chat. So,
Okay.
So this is why the community is so helpful, because everybody's using something different. We see someone say VidGrid.
Otter's a free app, so it's not expensive. That's
and
not
some people
expensive.
are using PowerPoint. And again, it depends on the resources and the processes at your institution. I know that at our institution, we have a central Panopto captioning service, so we need to send those off. And then depending on the time frame, you know, it can cost a different, it can be budgeted for, depending on the unit. Every unit is a little different.
Okay, let's see. Someone, Kim asked, is Ally with LMS similar to UDoIt from UCF?
It is. It is very similar to the UDoIt tool. Ally can be used with various LMSs. So I know that Blackboard, it was initially a Blackboard product and it's expanded. We use Ally with Canvas. We have not used UDoIt at our institution. I don't know if anyone else has experience using it.
Okay, Abdul Hamid asks, what is the average time needed to train faculty members on creating online courses? Whew, that's a question.
I think we would if we knew the answer to this question, I think we would be millionaires. No.
Yeah. I think it's an ongoing process.
Yes.
And like we said, the technology is always changing. But I mean, I don't. If you're going to get started, I don't think you can start with less than a 2-hour workshop to get started and introduce some of the concepts to people.
Okay, that's good practical advice, I think. Let's see.
Well, Barbara, that also ties into like some of the trainings that QM does and the ongoing training. I think it ties into the QM model because it can take years to really perfect your skills in these areas. But we always tell our faculty members when we're working with them at Pitt that it's about starting, you know, getting started, starting to make a change, picking an area and starting to develop that area and iterate from there. I think it's unreasonable, even when a new policy comes into play in force, there is a time lapse where you can start making materials, bringing them into compliance. It's impossible to do overnight. So we always start small and grow.
Well, thanks so much, Barbara and Ray. I would like to go on ahead and advance to a couple of the slides that we have at the end, and
certainly
we will. I will capture all of the questions that have not been answered, and we'll respond to those. So I just did want to mention a couple of upcoming opportunities with QM, the ABCs of online research. So you can take note of that if you are interested. That'll be July 22nd that workshop or that training begins. And then also QM Connect in October 2020 if you go to the events section of our website. And then at this point in time, I'm going to stop the recording and then ask for